Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal Sonny, a figure draped in power and mystery in Port Charles, had lived a life constantly teetering on the edge of danger. As a man deeply entrenched in the criminal underworld, he had faced countless threats, betrayals, and moral dilemmas. However, none of those previous challenges could have prepared him for the shock and anguish that would come with the death of Natalia. She was a woman he had tried desperately to protect, someone he had promised a new life, away from the chaos and violence that defined his world. Sonny had worked tirelessly to shield her from the dangers of his lifestyle, and he had believed that together, they could carve out a peaceful future far from the turmoil that had so long defined his existence. But when the devastating news arrived, it was not just another tragic loss, it was something more sinister. Natalia's death was not an accident, as many had believed. It was a carefully orchestrated plot, a ruthless betrayal hidden behind layers of manipulation and deceit. Sonny, typically composed and in control, was blindsided by the revelation. The shock reverberated deep within him, tearing at the fabric of his carefully constructed life. For the first time in years, Sonny found himself paralyzed by grief and guilt. He had failed her, and that failure tore through him like a knife. Natalia, a woman who had once trusted him with her future, believing he would stand by her side, had instead found herself alone and desperate in her final moments. The life she had envisioned with Sonny was nothing more than a cruel illusion, shattered by forces beyond her control. While the loss was heartbreaking for Sonny, the reaction of those closest to her was even more intense. Marco, Natalia's son, was inconsolable. To him, the death of his mother was not just a personal tragedy. It was an unforgivable betrayal. Marco had always known that Sonny operated in a dangerous world, one where loyalty was fleeting and lives were expendable. But he never imagined that Sonny, a man who had promised to protect his mother, would be the one responsible for her death. Marco's heartbreak quickly morphed into rage. The anger burned through him, transforming him into a man bent on revenge. He could no longer sit back and accept that his mother had been sacrificed for the convenience of Sonny's world. The more Marco thought about it, the more certain he became that Sonny was the architect of Natalia's demise, and that certainty fueled his desire for retribution. The idea of Sonny being the one who had caused his mother's death was more than Marco could bear. To him, it wasn't just a tragic accident. It was an act of cruelty, a message sent by a man who would stop at nothing to maintain his grip on power. The bond of family was not just broken, it was obliterated, and Marco's fury became an unstoppable force. The pain of loss fused with a thirst for vengeance, and Marco found himself consumed by a need to make Sonny pay for the wrongs he had inflicted upon his family. Marco wasn't just going to let this go. He would hunt down the truth, piece together the puzzle, and ensure that Sonny would never escape the consequences of his actions. But Marco wasn't alone in his quest for vengeance. Sidwell, a longtime enemy of Sonny, also had his reasons to want Sonny to suffer. Sidwell had endured years of suffering due to Sonny's actions, and the wounds he carried ran deep. He had long harbored a desire for retribution, and now, with Natalia's death as the catalyst, he saw an opportunity to finally strike back. Sidwell was a man of many secrets, a master of manipulation, and his hatred for Sonny had festered for years. His alliance with Marco was born out of a mutual goal: destroy Sonny at any cost. Sidwell was not the kind of man to rush into battle without careful consideration, and with Marco by his side, he became more determined than ever to exact his revenge. Together, Sidwell and Marco formed a deadly partnership, a combination of cunning and brute force. They knew that taking down Sonny would not be easy. Sonny had survived countless attempts on his life, and he was not a man who could be easily defeated. But Sidwell and Marco understood that they could not simply use force to take Sonny down, they had to outthink him. Patience and careful planning would be their weapons. They would need to anticipate Sonny's moves, exploit his weaknesses, and strike when he least expected it. The more they strategized, the more ruthless they became. This was not just about retribution for Natalia's death, it was about sending a message, about making Sonny pay for every wrong he had ever committed, for every life he had destroyed along the way. The tension between Sonny and his enemies escalated, and the danger surrounding him grew ever more intense. Sidwell and Marco were patient, but their thirst for revenge was insatiable. They would not rest until Sonny had lost everything. Sonny, always the man who controlled the game, now found himself caught in a web of lies and betrayal, his past coming back to haunt him in the most painful way possible. His attempts to protect his family and his empire now seemed futile as the forces against him closed in, tightening like a vice. As the battle for Sonny's downfall raged on, Michael, Sonny's son, stood at a crossroads. He had always been caught between loyalty to his father and a desire to carve out his own identity. But now, with the stakes higher than ever, Michael would be forced to make the hardest decision of his life. His father's life, his family's future, and the very soul of Port Charles were on the line. To protect Sonny, Michael would have to sacrifice more than just his peace of mind. He would have to confront the darkness within his own family, confront the truth about who his father really was, and decide whether the price of protecting Sonny was one he was willing to pay. The choices Michael made in the coming days would alter the course of his life forever, and he would soon realize that there was no turning back from the consequences of his actions. The stage was set for a war that would not only tear Sonny's world apart but also bring Marco and Sidwell into direct conflict with those they loved. What began as a pursuit of vengeance would soon turn into a battle for survival, one where no one would emerge unscathed. As the war against Sonny escalated, Michael found himself spiraling into a situation far darker than he ever anticipated. As Sonny's son, Michael had always been conflicted by his love and loyalty to his father, but also the unshakable knowledge that Sonny's world was fraught with danger, violence, and moral compromise. Michael had watched his father navigate the complexities of a life shaped by power, deceit, and ruthlessness, yet he had never truly understood the weight of those decisions until now. With Marco and Sidwell plotting their revenge, Michael realized that the time had come for him to make a choice that would tear him apart. To protect Sonny, Michael would need to sacrifice everything. It wasn't just a matter of saving his father's life, Michael's decision would determine the fate of his entire family, and even his own. The weight of this choice was unbearable. He understood that if he failed to act, not only would Sonny's life be in jeopardy, but his entire family could be torn apart. The lives of those he loved would be shattered, and that thought gnawed at Michael, gnawed at him so deeply that it consumed his every thought. For Michael, it wasn't merely about choosing between right and wrong, but about survival in a world where every move carried a heavy consequence. But the nature of the decision was far more complicated than just a life-or-death choice. Michael had grown up in the shadow of Sonny's legacy, but now he was being forced to step into the very world he had longed to escape. The stakes were higher than they had ever been. Marco and Sidwell weren't just enemies, they were relentless predators, ready to destroy everything in their path. The decisions Michael would make in the coming days weren't just about strategy. They were about navigating a web of betrayal, manipulation, and violent power plays. Every move would carry the potential to make things better or worse, and Michael knew that, no matter what he did, the damage was already done. In order to protect his father, Michael understood that he had to embrace the fight ahead fully, without hesitation or regret. This was no longer a game of negotiation or silent maneuvering, it was a brutal war where there was no room for weakness. He would need to confront the very real, tangible dangers that lay ahead and accept that not every battle would be won. To secure Sonny's future, Michael would need to make alliances with dangerous people, cross moral lines he had long avoided, and make decisions that could scar him forever. He knew that the world he had grown up in, the world that had always been defined by Sonny's power and influence, was a world that would never give him a second chance. He would have to be ruthless. He would have to act decisively. Yet, Michael also realized that this battle wasn't just about Sonny, it was about his family, his loved ones, and his very soul. The deeper he waded into the conflict, the more perilous his situation became. He wasn't just facing Marco and Sidwell's vendetta, there were other, unseen enemies in the shadows, enemies with long-held grudges against the Corinthos family. These were people who had been wronged, people who had waited for the perfect moment to strike, and Michael knew that they would stop at nothing to destroy everything he held dear. As the walls closed in on him, Michael began to understand the true cost of loyalty, what it truly meant to be a part of the Corinthos family. For a long time, Michael had struggled with the weight of his family name. He had always believed that he could carve out a different path, one that wasn't tied to the violence and chaos that had consumed his father's life. But now, as the darkness from Sonny's world threatened to engulf him, Michael realized that he could no longer escape it. He wasn't just fighting for Sonny, he was fighting for his own survival. He was fighting for the right to live in a world that wasn't shaped by the whims of ruthless men who held power over life and death. He had spent his life running from the world his father had created, but now that world had come for him. There was no turning back. The decisions that lay ahead would force Michael to confront the very nature of power and morality. Could he protect his father without losing his soul? Could he protect his family without becoming what he had always feared, a man consumed by the very darkness he had always tried to avoid? The cost of victory would be high, and Michael knew that some sacrifices were irreversible. As the battle between his family and the enemies of Sonny intensified, Michael found himself questioning everything he had once believed in. Each step Michael took down this perilous path was laden with risk. The danger was not only physical, it was psychological, emotional, and moral. He would have to navigate the shifting allegiances, betrayals, and lies that had come to define the world his father inhabited. Every choice Michael made would reverberate beyond the immediate moment, and every action would have its consequences. The enemies he faced were not just powerful, they were cunning and unpredictable, willing to exploit any weakness. There would be no time for second thoughts, no room for hesitation. Michael would have to trust his instincts and his determination to protect the people he loved. But in doing so, he might lose pieces of himself along the way. The more Michael found himself entangled in this war, the more he realized that the cost of survival was steep. The very thing that had always held him back, the desire for peace, the wish to live outside of the world his father had built, was now the thing that kept him fighting. But at what cost? What would be left of him when this war was over? And how much of his humanity would he be willing to sacrifice to win? As Michael prepared to face the forces that threatened everything he held dear, he couldn't help but wonder if, in trying to protect the people he loved, he was ultimately destroying the very thing that made him who he was. The battle between the underworld factions had spiraled into an unpredictable and volatile conflict. The tension was no longer confined to strategic maneuvers and mind games, it had evolved into a brutal war fought in the shadows. Bloodshed, betrayal, and assassinations were now commonplace, taking place in the darkness where no one was safe. Marco and Sidwell, fueled by vengeance and a thirst for power, were determined not only to destroy Sonny but to bring his entire family to its knees. Their plans were calculated and ruthless, and every move they made was aimed at unraveling everything Sonny had spent his life building. They weren't just after revenge. They sought to dismantle the very foundation of the Corinthos family and leave nothing but destruction in their wake. But what made this battle truly terrifying was the realization Michael came to: every decision he made, every step he took, could lead to catastrophic consequences for everyone he loved. As the war between these criminal forces escalated, Michael understood that protecting his family would come at a steep price. He was no longer just fighting to safeguard Sonny. Now, Michael was fighting to keep his family intact, to preserve their very existence in the face of overwhelming odds. And yet, each choice he faced seemed to offer no clear path forward. The deeper he was drawn into the conflict, the more the lines between right and wrong began to blur. There was no escape from the chaos that was consuming his life, and every action he took seemed to pull him further into a nightmare from which there might be no awakening. As the situation spiraled out of control, the tension reached its breaking point. What had started as a battle of power and revenge between Marco, Sidwell, and Sonny quickly became a war on multiple fronts, a fight that would shape the future of everyone involved. But the real battle wasn't just one between criminal empires. It was a war within Michael himself. The external conflict was only a mirror for the internal turmoil he was experiencing. Michael was forced to confront his own identity, his values, and the choices he had made throughout his life. In the face of violence, betrayal, and seemingly insurmountable odds, Michael struggled with who he was becoming and who he wanted to be. Could he hold on to his principles, or would he be consumed by the darkness of the world around him? The decisions Michael faced were not just about survival, they were about his very soul. Every choice he made could lead him down a path from which he might never return. The world he was fighting to protect was one built on blood, lies, and manipulation, but it was also the only world he had ever known. As he stood at the crossroads of his fate, Michael wondered if he was destined to lose everything, his family, his integrity, and ultimately himself. In the process of trying to save the people he loved. As the war raged on, it became clear that Michael's role in the conflict would be pivotal. His actions, driven by love and loyalty, could either seal the fate of the Corinthos family or lead to its ultimate downfall. But the weight of this responsibility was immense. The choices he made would not only affect the outcome of the battle between Sonny and his enemies, but also define the future of his own identity. Would Michael continue to fight for his family and the values he had always held dear, or would he be pushed so far that he lost sight of everything that mattered? The stakes had never been higher, and the consequences of failure had never been so dire. The psychological and emotional toll of the war began to weigh heavily on Michael, pulling him deeper into a spiral of doubt and despair. Could he maintain his grip on who he was in such an unforgiving world, or was he already too far gone to reclaim the person he once was? As the pressure mounted, Michael realized that the real battle was not just against Sidwell and Marco, but against the darkness within himself. Each move he made could either preserve the family he loved or destroy it entirely. The war had become as much a fight for Michael's soul as it was for the survival of the Corinthos family. At the heart of this turmoil, Michael found himself questioning everything he had once believed in. The values of honor, loyalty, and love that had once been his guiding principles now seemed to offer no comfort in the face of the overwhelming power of the criminal world. Could he navigate this treacherous landscape without losing himself? Would he be able to balance the desire to protect his family with the knowledge that, in doing so, he might have to become something he had always feared? A man capable of ruthless decisions and actions. In the end, Michael's journey would determine not only the fate of the Corinthos family but also the man he would become. Would he rise to the challenge and prove that he could uphold his values in the face of overwhelming darkness, or would he become a casualty of the very world he had spent his life trying to escape? The answers to these questions would shape his destiny, and as the war between these powerful forces reached its climax, Michael knew that there was no turning back. The battle had already claimed too much, and its final outcome would forever change the lives of those caught in its grip. As the war reached its peak, the stakes could not have been higher. The conflict that had started with a single betrayal, Natalia's death, had spiraled into an all-out battle for survival, not just for Sonny but for Michael, the Corinthos family, and everything they had worked for. Marco and Sidwell, driven by hatred and thirst for vengeance, had pushed the family to the brink of collapse. But the true cost of this war was not just the bloodshed or the power plays, it was the toll it took on the very souls of those involved. Michael stood at the crossroads, the weight of his choices bearing down on him like an insurmountable mountain. The conflict was no longer just about defeating Marco and Sidwell, it had become a fight for his own identity, his principles, and his future. Every decision he made, every action he took, had the potential to lead him further into darkness, or back to the light. The love he had for his family and his loyalty to Sonny were being tested in ways he had never imagined. The price of protecting them was no longer just the loss of innocence, it was the potential loss of his own humanity. As the war intensified, Michael realized that no matter what the outcome was, he could never go back to the man he once was. In the heat of battle, there was no room for weakness. The decisions had to be quick, ruthless, and decisive. Yet, with every step, Michael found himself questioning whether he was becoming something he despised, something he had always tried to avoid. In his desperate attempt to save the ones he loved, he feared that he was sacrificing the very core of what made him who he was. In the end, the fight for survival became a fight for redemption. The war wasn't just about outsmarting Marco and Sidwell, or even about protecting Sonny's empire. It was about Michael finding his place in a world that had always been defined by violence, manipulation, and ruthless power. The decision to stand firm in his values, or to embrace the dark path that the criminal underworld demanded, would determine not just the fate of his family, but his soul.